Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Noor, and I'm excited to be presenting at this symposium today. I'm going to go right ahead and share my screen, and then we'll get going. All right. So the topic of my presentation is making space and finding voice for the narrative of Muslim American youth. And I look at the educational journeys, both formal and informal, of female Muslim American high school seniors. I was intrigued by this problem statement because of increased racialization around the country after the 2016 election. We really saw an increase in institutionalized repression, an increase in Islamophobic rhetoric, and then really probe areas of a hyphenated identity that comes with being Muslim American. And in doing that, create a space for the counter stories of these students. I use critical race theory as my framework because it explores these very areas and creates a space for the creation of counter narratives. My research question was, what are the lived experiences of Muslim American high school seniors in their formal and informal educational journeys? One thing that was really important and that also ties into autoethnography is my own positionality in this study. As part of my personal journey, I was born and raised in Pakistan, where of course I was part of a majority population being Muslim. However, I was very privileged to have gone to a school and received an education where I was where the mode of instruction was English, so much so that we were taught to even think in English. That kind of puts you in this elitist group in Pakistan itself. Moving on from there, I lived in Malaysia for some years and have been in the United States for several years now. In the United States, of course, the experience was the polar opposite, where I became the marginalized minority population and lost that place of privilege that I grew up being very used to. In my professional journey, I have taught at Muslim schools across North America for the last 15 years. And in each one of the schools that I taught, what I really tried to do was engage with the students on how they perceive their identity to be. And one thing that was really pivotal in my professional work that led to this study that I conducted was over a series of 5 years. I asked our 8th grade students, all of whom were born after 9/11, how they felt about 9/11. And what was really insightful was that every year, every student that I asked, 98% of my total response was that these students felt guilty for 9/11. And this is, it's very surprising because they were all born after 9/11. However, they carry the guilt of association when they are born in this country as being Muslim American. Another thing that's insightful is my educational journey that led to the study itself. When I was doing my doctorate, in the first 4 courses that I took, when I was asked to introduce myself, I would evade the conversation of where I was originally from. And when I spoke about my professional experience, I would always say, I work at a faith-based school in Massachusetts. It was only in my 4th class, which was on social justice and education, that I realized what I was subconsciously doing over there. What I was really doing was making myself relevant to the mainstream experience and considering my own experience to be invalid to the large population. So when I said I work at a faith-based school, what I was really trying to do is reach out to a more generic definition of myself, because I considered my own experiences as an educator of a Muslim school to be very specific, to be very narrow, and to be irrelevant to the larger mainstream. And that's what got me thinking. I was like, look at this. I'm like a 30+ person. I'm in a doctorate program. Everybody over here has, of course, reached that kind of level of education where they can engage in this conversation, yet I'm choosing to invalidate my own experiences. So if this is something I'm doing as an adult, what is it that Muslim youth are going through in the same areas when they're so young, and when they're thrown into these realms of hyphenation. So I went ahead and looked closely at critical race theory. I looked at the spectrum of educational experiences that these students go through. I looked at representation of these students in curriculum and what they felt about that, and also looked at the extracurricular activities that these students might have been engaged in. And we really found that in a regular American high schooler gets exposure at the max to 2 Muslim protagonists in their entire high school career. And those 2 Muslim protagonists that they have exposure to are most probably the protagonists of I Am Malala and Khalid Hosseini's Kite Runner. And this is problematic because in both of those stories, the Muslim character that is portrayed, the Muslim protagonist, is not an American and is in fact a person who belongs to Islam in a far-flung country away from the United States. So really embedding this whole narrative that Islam belongs elsewhere, that faith and people who practice that faith belong elsewhere. And the protagonist of both of these stories are people who fight against mainstream norm, which is oppressive in both of those texts. So there is oppression happening in Pakistan, and Malala stands out against it. And there is oppression happening in Afghanistan, and the central character of Kite Runner fights against it. So really normalizing the barbaric, oppressive, stereotypical descriptions of Muslims, and how the protagonist sticks out because they do something that's against it. Again, these texts don't resonate with Muslim American students, yet that's what they're exposed to over here. I also looked at issues of identity. Muslim American students experience multiplicities of identity, and there's a great deal of intersectionality that happens over there with them being Muslim or female, male, what type of Muslim, what type of ethnicity they belong to, etc. And of course, there is a lot of impact that Islamophobia has on this identity navigation that these students go through. It is sad that anytime there is an act of oppression that is carried out in this country or elsewhere, like some psycho shooter, goes on shoots, guns down a lot of people, the first thing that comes into the mind of Muslim American youth is, oh, please don't let the perpetrator be a Muslim. So the first thought that comes into the minds of Muslim youth is not how many people passed away or what happened or what were the what were the details, but rather let not the perpetrator be Muslim, because that means we are going to be further demonized and criminalized for being Muslim American. Another third aspect that I looked at was acculturation and the degrees of assimilation, integration, or marginalization that these students feel. It is rather ironic that Muslim American youth, but true, Muslim American youth will always feel not American enough in the mainstream just because they carry a Muslim name, let alone be recognizable for being Muslim. And within the Muslim community, they will most often not be considered Muslim enough. They're too American. And this kind of dichotomy that exists or that is created between their identities is problematic. And add on to that double consciousness where the students are always perceiving themselves as how they are being perceived or being othered in their communities. I use critical race theory not only as my framework but also as my methodology, because it has the space for counter narratives and fights against a white washing or white sabotaging of the narratives of marginalized peoples. What I really wanted to do here was to have my participants tell their own stories. Now, I had 4 participants in the stories because it was a narrative study, and these 4 participants, all of them happened to be girls, and they were all high school seniors, and they had, interestingly, all had elementary and middle school experience in Muslim schools in America. And then 2 of them had gone on to public high school, and 2 of them had continued on to a Muslim high school. But let's take a look at these snippets that I have of their conversation. Hafsa says to us, I wouldn't know how it's like not to be an American because I haven't lived anywhere else. Now here's a student who was actually born in Ireland and moved to America when she was very little. A parents' country of origin was Pakistan, so she's brown skinned, and she ended up going to a high school that was predominantly white and faced discrimination on that high school campus. And it was only in diverse extracurricular groups where she was able to find a space for herself. She remembers the first 2 years of high school praying in hidden hallway corners because she was afraid to ask anyone of what she should do for the afternoon prayer, or struggling on the track cross country team because how she wore clothes was looked down upon by other people. Her last name was Akbar. As you're aware, oftentimes the phrase Allahu Akbar, which means God is great, is tied to terrorist attacks. So every time the attendance was being taken and her last name was called, students were sniggering at her for this. Another student that we had over here was Amber, and she says something really interesting. She says, I think the fact that I have such light skin and the fact that I don't wear a scarf is what's kept me from ever experiencing outright discrimination. She was Muslim American, but unidentifiable when you just look at her, and she felt that it was due to the lightness of her skin and the fact that she doesn't wear a scarf that people were not able to identify her as Muslim, that she got away with any kind of outright discrimination. And then we had Selma, who actually went to a Muslim high school, and she said she had very recently started wearing the hijab or the scarf, and she was also light-skinned and could tell the difference between how people perceived her before and after wearing the scarf. She would kind of blend into mainstream norm before she wore the stuff, and stood out like a sore thumb when she did start wearing it. She had instances of people flipping a finger at her and those types of things. But she was very, engaged in the Muslim tradition and really wanted to represent the Muslim tradition well. And then we had Rida, who also went to a Muslim school her entire life and had really interesting feedback to give us, which I think is very representative of a lot of students. She said, the school environment does not expand me as an American person within American culture, basically. It's like a very closed off type of universe. It doesn't feel like we're very connected to the world outside. So that was her feedback to Muslim schools, that she felt that there was an emphasis on developing a Muslim identity, and it was being seen as being antithetical to the American identity that these students hold. And almost like the American culture was being looked down upon, and these students were always being corrected for what this dichotomy seemed to be in the adults around her. So a lot of interesting stories from these 4 participants that I'd be happy to share more with you on the day of our discussion. Thank you and have a wonderful day.